Live from Washington. Now we move on to our next story. The 51st G7 summit is underway in Kananaskis, Alberta, Canada, commemorating 50 years since the inaugural meeting of the world's leading economies. Leaders including US President Donald Trump, French President Emmanuel Macron, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and the EU President Ursula von der Leyen are all attending. However, this is a summit that is going to be overshadowed by the current Israel-Iran tensions and the war in Ukraine. Joining me on the telecast is my colleague Megha Sharma. She's a senior executive editor of NewsX World, reporting live from Banff, Alberta. Megha, the group of G7 heads, 7 heads of states have arrived now, and what is day 2 looking like?
All right, day 1 of the G7's leader summit here in Kananaskis was all about the leaders of the G7 nations arriving one after another. The first leader to arrive at Kananaskis was Keir Starmer, the United Kingdom Prime Minister, who was closely followed by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African President. We had Ursula von der Leyen, who was also present, who also arrived, who's the President of the European Council, Shigeru Ishiba, the Japanese Prime Minister, Emmanuel Macron, who arrived at 7 p.m. local time, the President of France, and finally at 8:30 p.m. local time, the US President Donald Trump arrived in Kananaskis for the G7 summit. Today there is other leaders, the G7 plus nations, the 6 nations that include India, South Korea, Mexico, we have Ukraine, we have Brazil, we also have the World Bank head, the World Bank President Ajay Banga, who will be present at the G7 summit. He is slated to arrive tomorrow as well, and that's what is expected. There is going to be, of course, the G7 roundtable that takes place. There is also going to be the G7 plus nations roundtable that also takes place. After that, there are going to be bilaterals that are going to take place. The first bilateral has already happened between Mark Carney and Keir Starmer. This happened in Ottawa before the leaders descended to Kananaskis later in the day. There are going to be bilaterals that Mark Carney is going to be holding with the US President Donald Trump, which is going to be very significant. He will be hosting a bilateral on the sidelines of the G7 summit with his Japanese counterpart, with the French counterpart, the German Chancellor. There are going to be bilaterals with the invitee nations, who are the observer nations for the G7 summit, including India and Mexico and South Korea and Ukraine as well. So it's an important day tomorrow, because all the big meetings, the bilaterals, the pull-aside meetings will take place tomorrow. The joint communique, meanwhile, will be released by the G7 heads of states day after, on 17th of June, which is the last day of the G7 summit. President Trump has also announced a press briefing that he will be holding on Tuesday.
And Megha, Mark Carney has held his first bilateral with Keir Starmer ahead of the summit. And how are Canada-UK ties going to evolve in the wake of Trump's tariff wars?
Now, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney held the first bilateral of the G7 summit ahead of the G7 summit, in fact, with his British counterpart, Keir Starmer, and both leaders met in Ottawa. There were photo ops, and the leaders have spoken about stability and security, about procuring supply chains for rare minerals, about the strengthening of democracies. But on the anvil of the G7 summit, Keir Starmer was quick to mention that the talks are going to surround around the Middle East conflict that is escalating even as we speak. There is the Ukraine-Russia war that is also going to be discussed, was going to be big on the agenda, keeping in mind that the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has also been invited to the G7 leaders summit. But when it comes to the bilateral between UK and Canada, it's interesting to note, of course, just a few weeks ago, it was King Charles who had arrived in Canada to preside over the Parliament, and that was also this was touched upon by Keir Starmer, again reiterating the fact that both the countries, Canada and United Kingdom, have a long, fruitful history, and this is only going to forge into an even more strengthened bilateral ties, strategic ties, diplomatic ties. Now, in wake of the Trump tariffs that have unnerved Canada and United Kingdom particularly no end, talks in the bilateral that was held between the two heads of states also focused on how trade can be increased between both the countries. Now, Canada faces tariffs on aluminum, on steel, on lumber, and also a crackdown that Donald Trump expects from the Canadian government on the illegal immigrants entering into its territory, as well as the drug smuggling and the arms smuggling that takes place on the Canadian border, which Mark Carney has taken serious note of, and action is already started on the illegal immigrants. So again, between UK and Canada, this is going to be a shared interest, a shared cause of concern, and therefore bringing them together naturally as natural partners to forge trade ties, economic ties that are going to be mutually beneficial to them.
Now, building on to your answer, Keir Starmer has stated that the heads of states will discuss the unrest in the Middle East. What is expected to come out of it?
It is going to be the center of conversation. The Middle East crisis, particularly the missile strikes that have killed over 200 people in Iran, the strikes that were initiated by Israel, and there has been a counter-offensive from Iran that has struck Jerusalem and some other parts of Israel, including Haifa, which has led to the death of a few civilians. Now, while the G7 nations have shown a united stand against Iran, condemning its nuclear program, nobody, in fact, has come forward condemning Israel for its strikes on the residential areas, on civilians, on innocent civilians that have died a brutal death in Iran because of the onslaught of the IDF in the last 48 hours on Iran. So that is going to be an interesting aspect that is going to be looked upon. And what is it that is going to be not just discussed, but a resolution that will be brought about? So what is expected is, as per the statements that are coming in from France, from Germany, from United Kingdom, from United States of America, what they are saying is that dialogue is the key to any sort of peace talks that can happen between Israel and Iran. The US President, just a short while ago, on his Truth Social page, has posted that Iran and Israel should come on the table on the negotiating table to discuss peace. But it's also contradictory to what has happened on the ground in the last 48 hours. When Israel has been struck, its residential areas completely destroyed, its military infrastructure and nuclear facilities being handicapped because of the Israeli strikes. There are so many innocent civilians that have killed. How can anybody expect Iran to sit down on the discussion tables across Israel and United States of America for peace talks? This is particularly in wake of a number of talks that had been initiated by United States of America, and the talks were, progressing, and just before the negotiation talks that were to happen in Muscat in Oman on Sunday, there were these, Iran was completely bombarded, completely caught unawares by the Israeli strikes. So those talks have obviously come to a knot, and if any progress is to be made to deter Iran from enriching uranium and working on its nuclear program, definitely bombing Iran is not really the way to go for Israel. And yes, it doesn't seem like the G7 nations are fair to Iran when they refuse to even condemn and criticize Israel for what it has done in the last 48 hours, striking Iran.
Now, staying on the diplomatic front, I want to ask another question. Emmanuel Macron has stated he will raise the issue of imposing more sanctions on Russia. How are G7 nations going to navigate through it?
Yes, the French President Emmanuel Macron, who was in Greenland on Sunday before he arrived in Kananaskis for the G7 Leaders Summit, emphasized that he is going to be holding talks with the US President Donald Trump to persuade him to impose more heavier sanctions on Russia. Now, the NATO nations, barring United States and other European Union nations, have been unanimous in their resolve to target Russia through more sanctions, and also to build up their defense financing to counter the Russian attacks on Ukraine and not be completely reliant on United States of America. This has been a concern that has been raised by US President Donald Trump time and again, that US cannot be the savior of NATO. Every single time NATO goes to war, and particularly Ukraine at this point of time, that is in a conflict with Russia for over 3 years now. Donald Trump, who got himself involved in the conflict right at the start of his second term, hoped that there was going to be truce that was going to be negotiated by him in just 24 hours. Now, that has really been an impossible task for him. Despite the number of peace talks that his team has tried to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia, a number of these talks that are proposals that have been put forth, number of talks that have happened in Istanbul, phone calls that Trump has had with Zelensky and Putin, even face-to-face talks that Zelensky has had with Donald Trump, really have not brought any consensus to this war that continues unabated. How successful are the G7 nations, the 6 of the 7 nations, going to be in persuading Donald Trump to impose more sanctions on Russia is something that is anybody's guess. Trump at this point of time has not been favorable in his efforts to put sanctions on Russia, and that is because Trump is really wanting to be in the good books of President Putin, to have any iota of a deal that he could strike between Russia and Ukraine. Now, and to ensure that that happens, even if it's a rare possibility, Trump will have to strike a cordial tone with Putin, and imposing sanctions by America on Russia is not going to bring that result for Donald Trump. So again, a task at hand by the G6 nations, and including Ukraine, in wanting to impose more sanctions on Russia. But will Trump appease the G6 nations and Ukraine is anybody's guess.
Thank you very much for joining us, Megha Sharma, from all the way from Canada. Well,